Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk to you about the Baroque encyclopedia of instrumental forms. I'm referring to Telemann's Tafelmusik, musique de table, table music in English. Now, this is an extraordinary collection of works. Normally Bach is the guy who is supposed to be kind of encyclopedic. He did the Well-Tempered Clavier, and he did the Art of Fugue, and he did the Musical Offering, and even the B minor Mass. These are compendia of Baroque techniques of choral writing, of counterpoint, of keyboard artistry. Bach was like that. But that wasn't really an unusual tendency in Baroque music. Baroque music was, to a fascinating degree, and I just think from an aesthetic point of view, the thing that kind of separates it from what started to happen later as we got national schools that were increasingly politicized and geographically disunited by nationalist impulses and the urge to exploit folk music and other stylistic idioms. But compared to all of that, Baroque music was really an international style. It was pan-European, and Baroque composers liked to write works which took a little bit from everywhere and put them all together. And Telemann was no exception. Now, usually he's kind of sneered at as, the guy who wrote more music than anyone else in all of history, including like 12 million church cantatas and, thousands and thousands of things that we don't really play. And because he had a monopoly on music publishing in Hamburg, he was able to publish all of his music in like trillions of volumes, and we're never going to get to the end of it. We never are. There is actually a critical edition of Telemann that's proceeding apace, and it probably won't be done until the 35th century. But Tafelmusik is one of these wonderful, wonderful collections because he was a composer of genius. The hard thing is taking the time to figure out what made him special and also why his music matters. And so we have to pick and choose. We have to be selective. Thank God this thing exists, because if you have the Paris quartets and if you have Tafelmusik and other things, you can listen to any of his music and enjoy it. But here you get some of his absolute best work, and you also get all the things that make sort of Baroque instrumental music wonderful. What is Tafelmusik then? The title tells you nothing. In fact, the title has worked against it because table music suggests that it's something you're supposed to ignore, something, restaurant music to be played in the background while people are having dinner. Well, that's not what this is particularly. Can it be used that way? Yes, it can. In the same way that Bach's Goldberg Variations was composed to help a nobleman with insomnia get to sleep. The point is not that the music had a utilitarian use. The wonderful thing about the musical culture in which this was written is that there was no particular distinction between music for a didactic or practical purpose and great art music. They were one and the same. They were expected to be one and the same. Obviously, the table at which this music was played was not your average everyday table. It was a big table in a huge room with an orchestra in it. So you weren't exactly talking about, having your midnight snack by the fireside while listening to Telemann's Tafelmusik. You had servants and hired people who had to play this stuff. It was an exalted company full of sophisticated people, and the difference between music for mere entertainment or mere amusement or background and music that you were going to pay attention to did not exist. If you decided to pay attention to it, the seriousness and quality had to be there. People expected no less. They expected their composers to produce their best work at all times, even under those circumstances. So I think that we need to, first of all, deal with that aspect of it. Now, what is Tafelmusik according to Telemann? It's actually a series of 3 what he called productions. And each production contains an overture, a solo, a trio sonata, a quartet, and a concluding sinfonia at a minimum. And it's marvelous. You get everything there is to know about Baroque music, the instrumental music anyway, in these pieces. So let's take a look. I want to take you through each production just so you see the incredible variety that Telemann builds into this piece. It's extraordinary. I mean, if you know Tafelmusik, then you basically know everything there is to know about Baroque music. Oh, there's also a concerto in every production. I forgot to mention that. You'll see. Let's just go through them. So production number 1, there is an overture. Now, an overture, the overture actually, part of the overture is actually only the first movement, right? The usual overture was a French overture, which meant it began with like a march-like thing in jerky rhythms and then had a fugal continuation. And that was the overture, followed by a suite of dances. So this first one has a bunch of dances, and they are called, let us see, Réjouissance. Remember the Réjouissance from Handel's fireworks music? I think there's one in there. And then there's something like that. It's famous. Then a rondeau and a lour and a passe-pied dance and an air, a little quickly, and a gigue. So that's the first suite. Then you get the quartet. Now the quartet could be written for any number of players. Quartets, trios, solos in Baroque music have nothing to do with the number of people involved, because you always had a continuo, and the continuo was usually a keyboard instrument and maybe a cello and a lute and a guitar and whatever. You get 3 or 4 or 5 people just playing continuo parts, and then you had solo voices. So in a quartet, you have 4 parts, which could be played by 4 to 6 maybe players, 7 players. Same thing with trios. So we just have to keep that in mind. So then there's a quartet in 4 movements, and it's written for, let's see, it's mostly violins, and harpsichord. Then you have the concert. This is a 4-movement concerto type thing, and it's really quite. Let's see who's in here. We've got all kinds of stuff. Basically strings and flutes, cello, that kind of stuff. Then a trio, and the trio has 2 violins and continuo, and then a solo, which in this case is a flute, a transverse flute sonata solo, and all of those have 4 movements. And they all have 4 movements, and they are lovely. And then there's a conclusion. And the conclusion is an Italian sinfonia, a fast, slow, fast 3-movement thing, which of course later became the Italian type concerto that Vivaldi developed and that Bach often employed. So that's production 1. Production 2, we have the overture, which again is the overture movement, and then the suite. And in this case, the suite consists only of 4 airs. That's arias. But an aria, an aria doesn't have to be just slow and lyrical. In fact, these are all quick. They're marked tempo giusto, vivace, presto, and allegro. So it's a very, very lively overture. Then you get the quartet, and then you have the concerto. And in this case, the concerto is, 3 violins, and tutti. And then you have a trio, which in this case is for oboe and flute and harpsichord. And then you have a solo, which in this case is a violin sonata, and again, another conclusion in Italian sinfonia style. And the third production, the third production contains an overture, naturally, and then a whole wonderful suite of character pieces in the French style of someone like Couperin, like his keyboard pieces. They're marked bergerie, which is, shepherds. It's a pastoral thing. And in allégresse, and then postilions. Now, the postilions piece is quite wonderful. The postilions is, it's the mailman, the postman, the postal coach, the coach that brought the mail and other people in the coach. And, they had certain horn calls or, brass calls that they used to announce their arrival, and that the mail was coming with the people in it who were coming with the mail. And this particular postilions was borrowed, the post horn call only, not the entire piece, by Handel as the Sinfonia, the act music after the wise men are summoned to interpret the writing on the wall in the oratorio Belshazzar. So if you are really curious about where that little Sinfonia in Belshazzar came from, this is where it was originally found. Handel borrowed it. Now, whether they were working from the same source for the postilion brass fanfare that they both employ, or whether Handel actually borrowed from Telemann, who knows? But it's just an interesting little Baroque tidbit. And then after the postilion, there's a, let's see here. Oh, my goodness. Flatterie. It's a flatterie, if you're flattered. And a badinage, which is a little jest. And then a minuet. And that's the overture. Then you get the quartet, which here is for two flutes and violin. And then the concerto. And this particular concerto is for horns. Ooh, boy. It's for two horns and, with string accompaniment. And then you get a trio. And this trio is for two flutes and cembalo. And the solo is for oboe sonata this time. So you have a violin sonata, an oboe sonata, and a flute sonata. And then, of course, the conclusion, which is entirely in one movement marked Furioso. It's only 1 minute and 44 seconds long in this performance. So, as you can see, if there's anything that a Baroque composer could do is in here. And if Telemann had just wanted to provide background music for people to ignore, he would not have spent so much time and effort and energy trying to put together this reckless variety and range of music, of showing off everything that it was possible for him to do. The music is tuneful and bouncy and delicious and sentimental and sweet and melodic, and it's like I said, it's an encyclopedia of everything a Baroque composer could do. So now let's talk about some recordings. I mean, we can have a little fun. There have been quite a few, surprisingly. And the truth of the matter is, I have a couple to recommend, but they're all good. They really are. I mean, Harnoncourt did it with Concertus Musicus Wien. It's excellent. Bruggen did it with Concerto Amsterdam. It's excellent. There's one on Naxos with the Orchestra of the Golden Age that's quite good. There's one on Brilliant Classics. I have it. It's in a 50-disc Telemann box over there, so I'm not going to dig it out. But it's very, very good. This one I have sitting here, so I thought I'd show it to you. This is with the Freiburg Baroque Orchestra on Harmonia Mundi, but it's not available currently, at least that I've seen. Maybe it is somewhere. It's a pity that it's gone. There was another one, I believe, on Channel Classics that's quite good. And here's the one you're probably going to find. And this is the one I recommend only because that it's so much better than the others, but at least it's available and usually easy to get. This is Musica Antiqua Köln with, Reinhard Goebel. And it's on archive. And when it came out, it was a revelation. One of the things that the period music people have done, and we can't praise them enough for it. When they did what they did was revive pieces like this. Up until the period instrument movement, there wasn't anybody offering complete recordings of Telemann's Tafelmusik. And quite frankly, it is a complete integrated work. At least each production is. There are movements from it that were always performed on Baroque collections, the solo sonatas, a concerto, things like that. People would take out a trio or a quartet. There are bits that you could take out and play separately. And of course, that was legitimate in those days. It's legitimate now. But to actually understand the range of Telemann's genius and the incredible variety that he builds into this music, you've got to get the whole thing. And it's on 4 discs. This is a lot of music in here, folks. It's a serious, serious undertaking. And it's absolutely marvelous. And the other thing that I want to talk about just musically that I find fascinating about this, because we make such a distinction now between chamber music and orchestral music, but in the Baroque period, that didn't exist. First of all, classical chamber music which is only written for the number of players indicated, like a quartet has 4 people. That didn't exist in the Baroque period because of the continuo. So even chamber music for solo instrument, could have 3 or 4 participants. So to that extent, chamber music didn't really exist the way we think of chamber music today, since the classical period, since Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven codified the standard forms of chamber music. But also orchestral music, because it also had the continuo. And orchestras tended to be quite small, and it was just anything where you had an extra player or two to a part was an orchestral work. But as the period instrument people have shown, you could play these things with 1 person to a part. They could be the same size as a piece of chamber music, even though it's technically an orchestral work. So those distinctions in the Baroque period were not important. Music was played in smaller rooms, usually, right? And in a banquet room, for example, with a stage at one end or an area at one end for performers to entertain. And whether they did a solo or a trio or a full orchestral work, didn't matter. Even in Haydn's day and Beethoven's day, when you had concerts, I mean, the idea of having a symphony orchestra concert was almost unheard of. There was always a soloist who did something. There was always a singer and a piano. And a lot of the controversy about, for example, continuo parts in Haydn and Mozart symphonies arises from the fact that they all say that the composer presided at the keyboard. Well, of course he did. He did because, first of all, there were no rehearsals, and he might have had to fill in when the orchestra got lost and tell them where they were, number 1. And number 2, there were no conductors, so there were no conductor scores. And number 3, the composer was expected to call the audience and get a tune to play an improvisation on. It was an entertainment. It was a mixed entertainment. You would have a singer do a few arias. They might be accompanied by the piano or by the orchestra. You could have a soloist play a sonata. All of this was done in these smaller rooms at what were technically orchestral concerts up really until the middle of the 19th century, probably, and even a little further than that. So when we talk about the fact that Telemann is writing a solo and a concerto and an overture and a symphony or sinfonia at the end, that doesn't mean that they should be performed separately. They could all be performed at once in the same room with the same people on the same occasion, if that's what people wanted to do. So I really recommend very, very strongly that you get your hands on a recording of Telemann's glorious Tafelmusik. I love this recording with Musica Antigua Köln. It's exciting. It's very, 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 very musical and captivating constantly. You can listen to, an hour of it straight through. You don't have to play it all at once. I wouldn't recommend it. But you can dip in or you can play extended periods. But the point I just want to drive home is just how comprehensive Telemann's genius was and how wonderfully it's embodied in this magnificent, magnificent series of works. There's really nothing like it in the Baroque era as far as instrumental collections go, and not even by Bach, not even close. This is a marvelous, marvelous monument to the beauty, diversity, and variety of Baroque instrumental music. And so I urge you to keep on listening to Telemann's Tafelmusik. Enjoy, and if you enjoyed this particular little chat, please feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. There's so much more to come.